Good. I just said hello, everybody.
Hello.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
As you may know, tomorrow night is a hearing by the planning board of our mandatory solar petition for new construction, and because Sustainable Plymouth endorsed it and many of you signed the petition, I am asking you to speak in support of it tomorrow. I just send you the link and other information provided by Lee Hartman.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that, Anatole. All right, so it's 6:31, so we can get started. So it's nice to see some familiar faces and some new names and faces as well. So thanks for joining us for the September general meeting of Sustainable Plymouth. So this meeting will be recorded, so if anyone has any issues with that, just let me know. But we've had a couple of requests for people who are unable to attend, so we'll be recording this for them. If you're not already, actually, hold on a second. Let me share my screen. Okay, here we go. Okay, yeah, so if you're not already following Sustainable Plymouth on social media, please feel free. We're on Facebook and on Instagram, so we welcome anyone to join us in sharing the word. It'd be really great. And our the link to our website is also here, sustainableplymouth.org, which has some really great resources on there if you'd like to check that out. So let's see, we're going to get started with a brief overview of the organization. And you're going to get to meet the advisory board. And then we're going to have some updates from our working group, so you can hear about what Sustainable Plymouth has been up to, followed by some town news with what's going on in different sustainability initiatives. And then we'll move on to our guest speakers, Dave McGlinchey from Woodwell and Janet Williams from the Cape Cod Climate Change Coalition. And then, yeah, we're going to be wrapping up with a discussion and Q&A. Okay, so let's see. So just a reminder for anyone who might not be aware, Melanie Monaco did step down as our chair. But over the past couple of months, we've had a 5-person advisory board that's been carrying Sustainable Plymouth forward as far as leadership responsibilities. So in case you're not already familiar with us, we have Dale Bryan. Dale, if you want to say hi. We have myself, Andrea Dickinson. We have Melanie, Holly States, and Ken Stone, all of whom are on the call right now. And if anybody is interested in getting more involved in a leadership capacity, please, we welcome more participation in any capacity. So please feel free to reach out if you're interested. Okay, and moving on. So Sustainable Plymouth has 2 primary working groups right now. So we have the plastics and solid waste working group, and then the climate working group. So Ken Stone is going to bring us through an update of what's been going on with plastics and solid waste. And then Dale, along with, I believe, Melanie and Holly, will give us an update on the climate working group. I also put the dates and times for the next meetings, both of which are on Zoom. So if anything that comes up is of interest to anyone and you'd like to participate in either of those meetings, please, we welcome you to attend those meetings. And then if there's other activities or other initiatives that are unrelated to these 2 working groups that you'd like to see Sustainable Plymouth more involved in, please let us know. We're open to adding new working groups. So Ken, if you want to take it from there with the plastics and solid waste update.
sure. Well, basically at this point, there are 2 initiatives that are currently active. We're looking at the idea of banning nips, the small 50 milliliter bottles of liquor, and the 100 milliliters. Plastic litter, including nips, everybody on this call is probably familiar with the problems with that. There's been 3 towns on the Cape that have passed NIPS bans, Wareham, Falmouth and Mashpee. Chelsea has also passed one, and we're looking at doing the same thing. And we're working with the Network of Open Space Friends to do that. The network has run the cleanups for the past over 10 years. And this current cleanup is October 2nd. And part of what we're going to do at this cleanup is everybody's going to be given 2 bags, one for the regular litter and a smaller bag for collecting nips. And this is a way for us to collect some data regarding the frequency as well as the location of nips throughout town. In Falmouth, they found that nips made up approximately 32% of all the litter they collected. And in high traffic areas, it was 52% of all the litter they collected. And in Wakefield, they found that 70 to 75% of all litter collected was in one way or another alcohol related. So this is a significant problem. We're going to be collecting data, and that's going to hopefully be useful when we move forward with perhaps proposing a bylaw to address that. We are also doing work on curbside composting. Right now, the focus of that is in Red Brook and the Pine Hills, but we hope to bring it to the town as a whole. Food waste is, in fact, the largest portion of the waste stream going into landfills. People don't realize how much food waste there is out there. In Massachusetts, it makes up 25% of the waste stream after recycling. And in Vermont, at this point, household composting is actually required. So we're looking at promoting that throughout the town. We've started promoting it, and hopefully we'll have curbside composting going on with weekly pickup throughout the town in the not distant future. We also were looking at helping the schools with composting. Jackie Miller, who's on the call, was involved in that. But when COVID struck and schools ran into all their problems, we stepped away from that, and hopefully we'll return to that once things settle down. And then there's a list of other things in the pipeline. I won't go into any details with them, but we're looking at restrictions on plastics that can't be recycled, polystyrene, black plastic, straws. We are looking at increasing the number of water stations in the town, strengthening the bag bylaw that was put in place about 5 years ago now, developing, which is primarily something that Melanie has been doing, a volunteer green sustainable restaurant program. So there's a lot going on in the plastic and solid waste group. We need as many warm bodies as we can get. These kind of things take a lot of labor and time. And if you're interested in any of that, please get a hold of us through Sustainable Plymouth.
Great, thanks so much, Ken.
Sure.
So Dale, can you kick us off with the climate working group update?
I shall. I would ask everybody to think of the group as a kind of a learning lab where we educate ourselves about the issues that concern us. And then we take that learning and try to cook up some activities. Tonight's program in part is connected to the climate working group's ideas. Sometimes we act collectively, and other times we act individually or in pairs with support from the others. So for example, we had started a film series last year just at the onset of COVID, and Rosie and Andrea were the primary movers on getting a screening of the film Tidewater shown, but the rest of us collaborated on reviewing the film and understanding what it was about and what we thought the learning opportunity was. Melanie is both chair and a member of the group, helped spearhead a coalition to first compose a joint letter to the town manager and select board, which contributed to the development of the Climate, Energy, and Environment Task Force that Councillor Flaherty set up. And that expanded into a coalition that also focused on getting the declaration, climate emergency declaration passed, which did pass unanimously last month. From the outset, we've been interested in the findings in the report of the MVP Climate Ready Healthy Plymouth project. And so we've been promoting focus on those priority actions. And we're hopeful that there will be another MVP action grant submission that will be a regional collaboration with Duxbury, Kingston, and Plymouth, focusing on Plymouth Bay and some of the salt sea level rise concerns. I've been doing some work on heat islands and extreme temperatures, primarily of late trying to contribute to the hazard mitigation plan and thinking about emergency preparedness. And we can certainly use more people involved in that area. We're supporting in an educational campaign the work of the saltwater intrusion MVP grant that was awarded recently and that is underway. We're working with the League of Women Voters on that. And the other projects that concern us are stormwater runoff, solar canopies. We've been promoting the town community choice power supply program. And we have an active interest in climate literacy curricula and collaborating with the schools. But as Ken said, given all of the challenges at the schools, that too is something on hold right now. And energy efficiency is an area that we work in, and I'll ask Holly to take it from there.
Thank you, Dale. The Climate Working Group is collaborating with the Plymouth Energy Committee to promote Mass Save and other energy efficiency programs to Plymouth residents and businesses. We are focusing on raising awareness and participation among low and moderate income residents as well as small businesses. We've worked with the South Shore Community Action Council and Plymouth's Office of Community Development to understand the specifics of the various programs available to residents and to design outreach materials aimed at renters and homeowners. We're also exploring partnering with a Mass Save vendor that has worked with other communities in Massachusetts to connect residents with the Mass Save program. To help increase participation in energy efficiency initiatives among businesses, we have met with Eversource, a representative who specializes in the commercial sector, and we're seeking assistance in outreach to small businesses. We hope to ramp up this initiative as we move into the cooler weather and the heating season. Our goal is to connect more residents and businesses with opportunities that will reduce their energy use, save them money, and decrease their carbon emissions. And Melanie, if you want to, are you speaking about other initiatives? And you're muted.
Thank you. Andrea, am I up or?
Yep, if you want to take over with the town news, you had a couple updates from different areas of work with the town. Sure, take it from there.
Okay, great, thanks. So to back up just a second, I want to talk about the coalition that brought the climate emergency declaration forward and a little bit about what that was about. So we worked with 4 organizations, including Sustainable Plymouth. We worked with the Herring Pond Wampanoag Tribe, the League of Women Voters of the Plymouth area, Southeastern Massachusetts Pine Barrens Alliance, and us to draft the climate emergency declaration that was presented to the select board that passed on July 20th unanimously. So the select board adopted the declaration to declare a climate emergency, and that what we hope to do is raise awareness as to the issues and to help drive policy. That coalition that was the driving force behind that climate emergency declaration is continuing to meet to discuss moving a climate action net zero decarbonization plan forward. So we're meeting regularly, talking about a process, drafting an outline for a climate action net zero decarbonization plan that will be brought forward to the select board to hopefully adopt it as one of their goals. That so that coalition is one of the things that we're involved in. A few of Sustainable Plymouth's members and others are supporting the town in its effort to hire a climate resiliency sustainability planner position. That initiative was brought forth using the Climate, Energy, and Environmental Task Force dashboard process that Patrick Flaherty created. And the League of Women Voters was one of the driving forces in getting that passed on July 20th. So the select board voted to hire a climate resiliency sustainability planner, But some of our members and the League of Women Voters members and others are supporting the town in that effort by compiling data and researching sustainability planner positions in other towns. So that's one of the things that's ongoing. I am representing Sustainable Plymouth in the Sustainable Low Impact Development Project, which is an initiative of the Planning Board. This initiative is led by Frank Mand. And so we're currently working toward a matrix scoring system for potential developments. So that's something that's ongoing with the town. That is a town initiative, a planning board initiative. And then Patrick Farah informed me that the town is currently installing 3 more electric vehicle charging stations. One of them is at Manomet Recreation Area. One of them is West Plymouth Recreation Area. And the third one is the airport. So those are just some initiatives that are going on here in town. We did ask for, in the joint letter that 5 organizations presented to the town, we did ask for more electric vehicle charging stations, but Patrick Farah is really the person driving that initiative and having that at the forefront. So he's, I'm sure, doing a lot of work to make that happen, and we really appreciate it. And we really appreciate all the organizations that collaborate with us and the relationships that we have with people in the town who are allies and people who work with us in other organizations.
Thank you so much, Melanie.
Thank you.
All right, and Dale, if you want to take it from here with introducing the speaker portion of the evening.
I shall do that, but first a question, a little logistics here. Since you're sharing your screen, I can't see the chat, the toolbar at the bottom. So if there are chats that are occurring or questions that would be put on chat, can I not see them, or is there another way for me to see them while that screen is up, or when the speakers share their screens, will we be able to see that function? Don't know how articulate that was, but I can't see it.
So Dale, if you click the view in the upper right-hand corner,
Yes,
there's side-by-side speaker,
Got
should
it.
give you both. And do you see the chat now?
I
Down at
do.
the bottom?
Thank you very much. I was in the gallery mode. All right, so welcome and thank you everyone for coming to hear the main body of the evening, which is the presentation by Dave McClinchy and Janet Williams, focusing on the IPCC report and Plymouth. And I trust that every one of you knows that it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th assessment report that is being referred to. When I mentioned that the climate working group is something akin to a learning lab, many of us, if not all of us, have read stories about the report, news articles about the report itself. And if you're a scientist, it might come readily to you. If you're a non-scientist, it might be a bit of work to make good sense of it. So one of the things that we wanted this evening to do was to help educate us about the report itself. And this is why we reached out to our speakers tonight. Let me share with you their bios here in just a second while I change my screen so I can introduce Dave McClinchy. He is the Chief of External Affairs, oversees the Woodwell Climate Research Center's partnerships and policy outreach. He works on climate policy development at the US federal level and with a range of national governments and at the United Nations. He is a journalist and lawyer, and earlier in his career, he served as the Director of Communications and Marketing for the Plymouth-based Manomet Center for Conservation Sciences. Dave received his undergraduate degree from Wake Forest University and his law degree from Suffolk University Law School. I'll introduce Janet Williams separately when it's her turn to speak. And with that, I'll ask Dave if he can join us to make his presentation.
Thank you so much, Dale. Am I coming through okay?
Yes, everyone.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me, but also more importantly, thank you for committing your time to such an important cause. Very much appreciate that. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. How about that? Did that work? Great, fantastic. So thank you, Dale, for inviting me to join the meeting this evening. As Dale said in the introduction, I'm going to speak a little bit about the recent assessment report from the IPCC. The IPCC process is near and dear to our hearts here at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. Because as some of you may know, for 35 years, we were known as the Woods Hole Research Center. We just changed our name about 13 months ago because there's a whole bunch of scientific institutions here in Woods Hole, and there's general confusion. People just assume we're all branches of the same operation. But in fact, we are an independent operation that studies climate change specifically. And we designed and developed and launched the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in the early 90s, which of course is the parent organization of the IPCC, which issues these assessment reports. This year's edition was the 6th assessment report, and Woods Hole, now Woodwell scientists have been co-authors on every iteration of that. So we think it's important, but I want to talk a little bit today about what it is and what it isn't. And then I'm going to move into a little bit of detail on kind of what, the path it shows us forward and what that means specifically for Southeastern Massachusetts. So first of all, it's important to remember that this is effectively a synthesis report. This is a summary of what we already know. So while the headlines were alarming, while the news coverage was certainly, and I think appropriately, scary, it wasn't new. This wasn't new science that was being brought out. These weren't new findings. But it is a certain validation when this all comes together. And the process of selecting and synthesizing and writing this report is a consensus process. Everything needs to be agreed to. Everything needs to be kind of widely adopted by all the authors. And what that means is you end up with, if anything, a conservative estimate of where things are going. So while the results were alarming, I think we can consider them to err towards a conservative viewpoint on scientific research to date. Of course, if you saw what the actual findings are, and if you think of those as conservative, that's even more alarming. The report told us a lot of things. It told us, for example, that concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is greater right now than it's been at any point in the last 2 million years. It told us that the extent of summer sea ice in the Arctic is lower than any point that it's been in the last 1,000 years. It also showed us that a lot of the impacts we're seeing are not just here with us now, but they're actually increasing. The rate of sea level rise, for example, has, I think, approximately doubled over the last 15 years. So there's a lot of bad news in here, but I'm not just going to give you bad news tonight, because there's actually a little bit of good news in here as well. It's buried, you got to dig for it, but there's good news in here. So first thing it told us is that we've already experienced about 1.1 degrees of warming since pre-industrial levels. I'm going to show you some maps, some climate models for what's happening in Southeastern Massachusetts at 1 degree, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and 2.5 degrees of warming. But right now we're treating 1 degree, approximately 1 degree as our baseline. Interestingly, the report also points out that effectively we're already at 1.5, except for the cooling effect of particulates from human pollution. So in a very weird way, we've softened the blow of our own climate change through the amount of smog we put in the atmosphere. That's not a popular message. We're not suggesting smog as a long-term solution, but interesting nonetheless. The other thing the report told us, and this is still the depressing part, I'm not to the good news yet. The other part, the thing the report told us was that for the next approximately 30 years, until about 2050, our impacts are largely locked in. We're going to see what we're going to see simply because of the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that's occurred to date. That's not great. Obviously, even at 1 degree of warming, we're seeing significant effects. We're seeing, my basement's flooded a couple times in the last couple months where it hadn't for years and years. So So already we're seeing changes in precipitation. As I mentioned, sea level rise encroaching. You're seeing Boston flood in ways that it hasn't flooded before. And that's going to continue for about 30 years. But, and this is the good news part of it. After 2050, where we go is pretty much up to us. There are multiple pathways that humanity, society, civilization has post 2050. And the worst of them are pretty terrible. We're not talking about kind of levels of impact that are uncomfortable or that need to be kind of adapted to. We're talking about, in some ways, I think, systemic collapse of the structures, the societal structures that we rely on. But there are also pathways we can choose through immediate and significant cuts to emissions that really would put us on a much more tolerable path, and more importantly, put future generations on a much more tolerable path. The generations who have had nothing to do with these emissions, but are going to inherit this problem. And then along with emissions cuts, essentially by 2050, if we want to be on these sustainable pathways, we need to be at net zero before or by 2050. And net zero effectively means that you dramatically cut your emissions, but you also deploy some pretty significant CO2 removals. There are a lot of efforts underway to figure out how to do that mechanically. But right now, the best tools that we have to do CO2 removal at large scale is nature, effectively forests, soils, salt marshes, things like that. We have not invented a process that is more effective than photosynthesis. It is still the best thing we got going for us. It also has the benefit of having a lot of byproducts that we enjoy, recreation, a lot of natural benefits, a lot of biodiversity. So that's only good news. So the silver lining of this report is that there is a pathway to a safe and stable climate, or maybe back to a safe and stable climate, but it requires immediate and urgent action. All right, so I'm going to take about 7 more minutes or so to walk you through some work that team at Woodwell has done looking at heat projections, heat trends for southeastern Massachusetts. And just a little bit of context, Woodwell has 5 major program areas. 2 of them are geographic, Arctic and tropics, working in those areas of the world. We have a water program that studies freshwater, nearshore hydrological systems, largely as an indicator of ecosystem health. We have a carbon program that studies exactly what I just talked about, how to remove large amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But we also have a risk program that does effectively just risk modeling. They run both global climate models and regional climate models to understand probabilistically what we're heading towards. And we're going to look at that now. So the first set of maps we're going to look at are days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And I mean, I think this is a fairly intuitive temperature threshold as being pretty uncomfortable. And right now, it's a pretty rare event. Certainly on Cape Cod, where I live, it's something we almost never see. But even up your neck of the woods, it's a fairly rare event. And I'm actually going to point one thing out here. The modeling is divided by grid cells. And so if you look at a grid cell like Plymouth proper, a large amount of the cell actually falls into the ocean, which is going to make that particular cell cooler than, like, kind of the average of that whole cell is going to end up being cooler than maybe the land experience would be. So as you look at this progression, I encourage you to look at the cells kind of around Plymouth as indicative of what would happen actually on land in Plymouth. So this is, as I mentioned, kind of where we are now. But the report says we're heading towards 1.5 degrees. And with that, you start to see the model showing these hotter days extending down towards Plymouth, kind of towards Weymouth along the South Shore. And then at 2.5 degrees, sorry, I have a toolbar here in the absolute worst place, 2 degrees, you see further encroachment. And then at 2.5, which we are on track to hit, this is not kind of some far-fetched fantasy. This becomes, potentially like a month of the year in Plymouth. So another indicator we look at is frost nights. This is important for a lot of agriculture. This is also just kind of important in terms of how we understand our lived experience. And right now, as you can see, Plymouth area, my part of Cape Cod, will experience somewhere between 1 to 3 months of nights that fall below freezing. As you see the temperature progress, you see that change, and you see kind of the lower threshold move along Cape Cod towards Plymouth, and further. Oh, sorry, I'm going too far there. And so this experience where there's a significant number of these days, upwards of 3 months, really recedes from southeastern Massachusetts entirely, and we are left here with a much warmer experience. But then the flip side of this, which I think is very important, is nights above 68 degrees. And this is something that we think about a lot because people tend to think about extremes during the day, but when it doesn't cool down at night that much, it's difficult to get rest. It's difficult to recuperate without kind of an air-conditioned environment. And of course, if everyone's relying on air conditioning, that's a huge energy drain. And in this situation, we see this being a fairly rare occurrence, less so, even less so. And then in a 2.5 degree world, essentially, the idea that this is kind of a rare occurrence in southeastern Massachusetts is gone. The last thing I want to talk about is the way the assessment report treats permafrost thaw. And the initial instinct is that there's no permafrost in Massachusetts, there's no permafrost in the lower 48 continental states, so why would we be worried about that? The reason we are is that permafrost contains an enormous amount of carbon locked up in those frozen, undecomposed organic materials. So we can look at kind of short-term impacts in terms of warming, and then you can actually take that warming and see what that means in terms of precipitation changes or drought, and we do that as well. But on the other hand, there's this kind of underlying, and I think fundamentally existential threat of permafrost thaw. As permafrost, so the definition is ground that remains frozen for 2 or more consecutive years. As it thaws, that undecomposed organic material does decompose, and depending on the situation, how wet the soil is, things like that, it's going to decompose, break down, and emit either methane, carbon dioxide, or occasionally nitrous oxide. You all may be familiar with the fact that methane is a shorter-lived greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, but is significantly more potent. And so permafrost thaw is a real concern. And AR6, we believe, at Woodwell, we believe, significantly underestimates permafrost thaw because of exactly what we said, because of a lack of research and kind of a consensus erring towards a conservative interpretation. But this is important to pay attention to because the things I showed you before are fundamentally discomfort. We're talking about discomfort. If we have runaway permafrost thaw, it's pretty much game over. So you can see in this map here, the amount of permafrost that is currently covered, the amount that we anticipate being covered in 2050 using RCP 8.5. That's kind of the worst case scenario, which frankly we're on right now. And then where that goes in terms of 2070. Currently, permafrost underlies 24% of the Northern Hemisphere land area. If we lose as much as we potentially could lose, we're entering what we call a hothouse Earth scenario, where essentially the emissions from biophysical feedbacks, like permafrost thaw, like forest loss, would accelerate warming to a point that we really couldn't contain it. And so you just have a self-reinforcing cycle where the warming causes more biophysical feedbacks, the biophysical feedbacks accelerate the warming, and then you're just out of control. And at that point, you're talking about a 3, 3.5, 4, 4.55 degree world, which it's difficult to model kind of unemotionally because the impacts at that point become so enormous. So I leave you with that thought because I think it's important to understand the stakes of what we're dealing with. The idea that this isn't simply increased discomfort, this isn't retreat from the shoreline, this isn't everybody get air conditioning. At a fundamental level, the stakes are really existential. And until that thinking permeates kind of our policymakers and our decision makers approach, we're going to stay on this business as usual track. And this 2050 pathways that we have to choose from will be decided for us. So thank you for your time. And I very much look forward to Janet's much more uplifting comments.
Don't take it too much of a command, Janet, but we probably all want to hear something positive. But the truth of the matter is that there are things that are happening in the Southeast Mass area by a number of towns. And Sustainable Plymouth is one of the organizations. The others that you've heard mentioned tonight are doing what they can do, what we can do to try to move policy, practices, programs in a positive direction. Janet is going to give you a sense of what is going on the Cape with the 5C collaboration and her work in Chatham. But the background that you should know is that she has environmental law education and consulting experience. She spent a dozen years as an environmental enforcement attorney with the EPA, 5 years providing legal counsel to commercial real estate developers and lenders, and several years building and teaching social science education programs at the secondary level. She discovered a passion for and commitment to fighting climate change while volunteering as a pro bono legal researcher with the Climate Justice Program in London in 2005. And that was part of the platform that brought her to the work that she's doing now. She's the chair of the Chatham Conservation Commission. She's on the steering committee for the Chatham Climate Action Network. She's secretary for the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative. She's a member of the Conservation Law Foundation. Her BA is from Boston College, and she has a JD from the Villanova University School of Law. And with that, Janet Williams will tell you what's going on in the Cape and how we might be able to think about that in the work that we're doing in this area. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you, Dale, and thank you to Sustainable Plymouth for inviting me tonight. You've designed a well bookended program here, following Dave's. And I can't call it doom and gloom because, you know, AR6 is what it is, and it's a science. It just reports scientific consensus about the facts, we don't have the luxury of spending a lot of time thinking about what to do. And so what I'm here to talk about is how do we make change at the local level? We're going to need change. The kinds of changes that AR6 is anticipating in a very short time frame requires change at every single level, from international bodies through national governments, state, regional, local, down to individual. Every single one of those levels has to metaphorically get up off the couch and begin to really move and take the action, because the time is really short. But I'm here actually for two organizations. The Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative, if you haven't heard of us, we're a coalition of organizations and businesses, towns, and community members from across the Cape and Islands. We're working together on solutions for the climate crisis. And we do this by working to enhance communication, collaboration, and opportunities for activism. And so we are working across the entire region. The Chatham Climate Action Network is a network within the Climate Collaborative. We are, I think, much as Sustainable Plymouth, we are comprised of a smallish core group of local volunteers who are committed to moving Chatham to address the multiple climate threats that our town faces. And so because we're focused on the town, that's my focus for this evening, is action at the local level. As Dave pointed out, the severity of the risk that climate change is presenting us with means what we do as individuals is never going to be enough anymore. And we all know how we can shrink our carbon footprints. We all know the changes we can make in our lives, the choices that we make as consumers. We can switch to renewable energy in our homes. We can do all of these things, and it's not going to be enough. The problem is so great in both scope and in scale that we need collective action if we're going to try to move the needle in the time frame that we're talking about. So let me tell you a little bit about Chatham and our Climate Action Network and what we've been doing. So we were formed in January of 2020, coincidentally at the same time that the Climate Emergency Declaration was brought to Chatham to try to enlist support in the town. It happened actually at the very same meeting, at our initial organizing meeting. Somebody came with the petition. And so that was coincidental, but it was very lucky because it gave us an organizing framework and a tangible goal to aim for. And everybody at the meeting, and there were a group of about 40 to 50 people who were there, got excited about the declaration, signed up to work on it. We started making some plans. And then of course, like everything else, it was derailed by COVID unexpectedly. So we did two things in response to that. The first thing is we said, this declaration is going to pass. So let's move beyond that and ask ourselves, what comes next? You know, making a climate emergency declaration is a foundational statement that you build upon. So let's assume that it's going to pass, of course it will, and start moving and organizing and taking the action about how you build on that. And while we're doing that, we got to figure out how to do that virtually because we can't do any of our usual in-person actions. And so in order to figure out how to address the community in a virtual way, we started looking at Zoom and things like that and tried to leverage that. But in planning actions, why is it saying I can't advance my screen? There we go. We always wanted to keep in mind the climate action goals. And like everybody else, they fall into the two broad categories of mitigation and adaptation. On the mitigation side, what can we do that will reduce emissions here in the town at an individual level, at the town level? And what can we do to remove some of the gases that are already in the atmosphere? And as Dave said, there's a lot of work being done on that. But we are interested only in the natural solutions. We're not geoengineers, and that stuff's interesting and a little scary, but we're focused on what kind of actions can we take at a local level to leverage natural solutions to removing carbon from the atmosphere. The adaptation, which we think of as resilience, this comes exactly from one of Dave's talking points. That is partly scary, but it's really important that we all understand that these impacts are going to happen regardless of how much we succeed in reducing emissions. AR6 has told us we're locked into 30 years of worsening impacts, no matter what the world does. There's just so much carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere that it's going to continue until at least the middle of the century, even if the aggressive and urgent cuts are taken in the next 10 years. That's not going to change what we've already got in the atmosphere and the coastal impacts that we're going to experience. And so some of the effects that we saw this summer, from extreme droughts, severe heat waves, wildfires, catastrophic downpours, severe storms, flooding, these are going to keep happening for the next 30 years, and we have to prepare for those impacts. And so that's how we think about resilience. And so resilience, because of where we are, Chatham we're surrounded on three sides by water. You have, I think, a long coastline because Plymouth is so large. You know, our understanding of resilience is to protect our at-risk coastal areas from the combination of unrelenting sea level rise and increasing storm surge and storm intensity and erosion that's going to happen on the coastline. So that's how we think about resilience. Everything needs to fall into one or two of these two categories, ideally both, some do, built on a foundation of always making sure we are engaging the community and sharing what we're learning with them. I always hesitate to use the term education because it implies that, you know, we know something you don't, and there's a little bit of an attitude that I think can put people off, but we try to think of it as the community learning together. We have access to information, we share that information with the town. So we went forth and did what the IPCC report has urged and taken an all of the above approach. So in 2020 and 2021, we did indeed pass the climate emergency. It's, as I said before, it's a foundational statement. It provides, we think, the basis for integrating the consideration of climate change impacts into decision-making across all town bodies and functions. That's our goal, is to not have anything as a standalone, but we want to make sure that climate change mitigation and resilience is part of every decision that's made by everybody in the town. Couple examples of how that has played out. The next thing after the declaration was passed was to require the town, this is a pure mitigation effort, to procure electric vehicles. So we put out an article at town meeting to require the town to purchase or lease electric vehicles or a plug-in hybrid whenever possible. There's a provision that allows the town to purchase a non-electric if there's no electric vehicle which can meet the specific needs of that procurement, or if the cost of the electric vehicle is materially more than what a conventional vehicle would be over the cost of the vehicle's entire lifetime. So this article, this concept brought life cycle, or certainly lifetime operation and maintenance costing into the equation. And that was deliberate, and that was very important. The second article that we put forward was a requirement that the town consider net zero design options when putting out RFPs for capital facilities projects. It requires that any new construction project done for or by the town includes pricing for a net zero option, so that energy and emission savings can be evaluated over the lifetime of the building for cost effectiveness. There's no obligation that the town actually select the net zero option, but this analysis will ensure that the information that we have about future projects includes lifetime costs to build and operate facilities, and brings the emissions over the life cycle of the building into consideration. So both of these requirements were put forward as bylaw articles by our energy committee and required town meeting approval. So we're a little bit different from Plymouth in that we have direct town meeting. We don't have town meeting members. So in Chatham, getting something passed a town meeting is all about getting out the vote. And so we launched an effort to outreach and advocate for the community and bring them together. And this is the community learning together approach to build support for these bylaws and to create also a foundation for further action. So we, in the era of COVID, we thought about a couple of strategies that would work in this area. So we designed our engagement to promote climate actions that are ongoing in the community. There's a lot of things happening that people don't necessarily know about. And so we wanted to highlight what some organizations, some businesses, some institutions are doing. This will help, I think, we thought, develop support for climate actions going forward and building some community coherence. We want this engagement effort to connect people in a way that they weren't necessarily connected before. Just like Plymouth, I imagine, we have a pretty broad spectrum of demographics. I mean, in some ways, in other ways, we're generally old and white, but other than that, there's a very broad spectrum politically, certainly. And so we wanted to try to reach people who had not been part of this conversation, to get beyond the choir, as we put it, and expand our cohort of supporters, and to provide information to help the community members understand the details of some of these complex bylaws, because they were pretty complicated. So we developed a series of webinars using Zoom to help us. And so we did the first two last year in 2020. The first one was called Chatham Acts on Climate. We invited representatives of 9 organizations plus a couple of the town departments to come and describe how climate change fits into their mission. and what actions they have taken in the last year to try to either mitigate for climate change or pursue resilience or adaptation. The second one we did last summer was called Transitioning to Climate Smart Landscapes. This was one of the attempts to move beyond the choir and to try to speak to people who have not been part of the conversation. And we did it through gardening. Who doesn't love that? And so we used the word transitioning very deliberately because we weren't going to tell people to tear up your lawns tomorrow, but we did start to move to the message of it's beginning to shrink how much of the space that your over fertilized and irrigated lawn is taking up. Could maybe shrink a little bit, and you could maybe put out some native plants. And we brought in some horticultural experts to talk about some of that, and landscape designers to talk about that. And the Garden Club was actually one of the sponsors of the event. So that was good, and we hope that we tried to get beyond and get deeper into the community. And so then we followed that up this year with two events, one connecting, and this is what we were talking about earlier, and this is one of the things that the Chatham Can is very active on, is protecting climate resilience through our natural resources. So we connected dots that people didn't necessarily understand in terms of particularly woodlands and salt marshes, and laid out the amount of carbon storage and sequestration that both of those areas are capable of providing in terms of removing carbon from the atmosphere. And at the same time, they're both distinctly threatened, woodlands mostly by development, and salt marshes mostly by rising sea level. And so making those connections, we think, was helpful in bringing people to look at these in a slightly different way. And then we pivoted a bit and did one connecting some other dots for people on climate change, health, and diet, brought in some nutritionists and folks from Cape Cod Healthcare to talk about the climate implications of pursuing a plant-based diet. And so that was very interesting and popular, and we're going to follow that up this year. We're going to partner with a couple of restaurants to do some demonstration menus on plant-based diet, and let people come in and enjoy that. So we try to take a distinctly non-threatening approach to getting people to come in and talk about things that they were inclined to talk about before, and bring them into that conversation. And so that leads us to, what are we doing next? We actually just met today to talk about what we are going to plan for next year. And as I go through these, I'm just going to point out, in all these places where you see underscoring, most of these places anyway, these are all live links. So everything that I'm providing here, I sent the slides to Dale, he has them, and all of this material is linked. So you can get copies of the bylaws that we were just talking about. You can get copies of all of this will be available to you. We are going to develop and promote adoption of a net zero building code. I'm not sure it's going to happen this year. It depends on how soon the Office of Energy Resources updates the state building code, the changes that are coming to the stretch code, and there will be an option for a net zero building code. And our energy committee, and I'm going to pause and say it's been renamed. It is our Energy and Climate Action Committee. Is poised to make the case for the town to aim for the net zero building code option, they're beginning to pull together the materials to make that case, and to convince the voters of the town that that is exactly the right thing to do. 3 of our members of the Chatham Climate Action Network sit on the Energy Committee. So that's helpful. We know that our concerns and our voices are being heard there, and informing the decisions that they are making. We are also working to promote the Cape Cod Climate Collaborative is having an upcoming net zero conference. It'll be the 4th annual conference. It's in October. It's both virtual and free. And they're going to be mostly focusing on the new legislation the next generation pathway legislation with the four, and focusing on each of those 4 pillars and how that translates into local action. So definitely would encourage you all to attend, because it's statewide. It's not limited to, there's very little material in the day that is Cape Cod specific. It's really general on the state level. So if you click on that link, it'll take you to the conference information site. And in fact, registration for the conference opened today. It'll be October 29th. It's an all day. And again, you don't have to leave your computer, and it doesn't cost anything. So urge you to check that out. We're looking at advocating for further water usage restrictions. I'm sure it's the same in Plymouth as it is on Cape Cod, where despite all of the rain, actually you guys got a lot more, because all of those huge downpours turned north just before they got to Chatham, and we did not get replenished in the way that other places did. So we still have huge problems with water, and we're looking at trying to get the town to take steps toward regulating private water wells. But the thing that I've been working on, and that I'm excited about, is to promote at town meeting a climate resilience bylaw to provide much more robust protection for the coastal resources that we need for both their mitigation and their resilience function. So let me just tell you a little bit about that. Again, we know that this is both a mitigation and an adaptation strategy to protect the carbon storage and sequestration capacity of the woodlands and the salt marshes. And it's a resilience strategy to protect against the climate impacts. We know that when these resources are lost or damaged, we experience the double whammy. They release the carbon that they've been storing, and they are no longer going to store anymore. So it's a feedback loop that grows when you lose these natural resources. The Cape Cod Commission over the past year was working with the Urban Harbors Institute at UMass Boston and some others, and developed a model coastal resilience bylaw. They involved 4 of the Cape Cod towns in that development, and it was published in June. And for the first time, it's going to add a new layer of protection by creating a new protected resource area called a coastal resilience zone, which encompasses some of the existing protected areas, but expands some of them. And it does it in a couple of interesting ways. So for one way, coastal floodplains are defined by FEMA flood maps largely, and FEMA flood maps are derived from historical data. And so they're largely inadequate in terms of being able to deal with sea level rise, because you're always going to be looking backward instead of projecting forward. This bylaw taps into a new model that has been developed that projects sea level rise in conjunction with expected storm surges when identifying areas that are at risk for flooding. And so it's a larger area. It's a much more realistically defined area, and it's the threatened area that we have to prevent further degradation and development of. It also, interestingly, provides protection for areas between existing salt marshes and the uplands behind them, so that there is room for the salt marshes to migrate. As sea level rises, salt marshes have to be able to migrate landward. If they can't, if that migration is blocked by roads or other development, they become inundated with seawater and they die. It's been referred to as drowning in place, because they cannot be inundated with water at all times. They require periods of lower tide. So this bylaw will protect from development the likely migration routes. And there is information about how that's determined, how you work out where those migration routes are and how much you need to protect. So it's going to require some changes to the Chatham bylaw. So it'll require changes to the wetlands protection bylaw, probably the zoning bylaw, and have to be approved at town meeting. And so we will have to, once again, get out the vote. And so it's all part of this larger community engagement and advocacy outreach effort that we have. It's a three-pronged effort. One is, as I change the laws by changing the bylaws, getting people to show up at town meeting and vote for it. Promote changes at the lower levels as well, through town actions, through regulations, through policies that are developed and adopted by various bodies, and through community outreach to support those two. And so community outreach, when you're talking about making sure that climate issues and climate impacts are considered and addressed in town decision making. You know, it comes down to these three elements that we, as members of the network, expect ourselves to do. And we ask our allies, our partners, our family and friends to do it as well. You know, the day of sitting on the couch with your phone in your hand tweeting is done. That's not going to cut it at all. You've got to show up. You have to go to the meetings and the hearings. When people show up, and especially, you know, now that we're all, I don't know how many of yours are still virtual, we're in about a half and half, but when it's on a platform, you see how many people are there. And so that has an impact on decision makers who, you know, never forget that their decision makers are town volunteers. They're just citizens who are volunteering their time to do this. If people show up, they take notice. So you show up, you speak up. Just showing up's not enough. You gotta speak up. You have to ask the hard questions of people who are making proposals that may not actually be helpful or may be harmful to our interests in protecting the climate. You need to ask, you need to advocate for the best outcome. Again, I don't think people have a really good appreciation for how much power they have. You know, these decision-making bodies, these citizens, when people show up and they make well-reasoned arguments and they point out the facts and they advocate for an outcome, it often happens. I mean, I've been surprised to see how often that dynamic plays out in Conservation Commission hearings, and in zoning hearings, when neighbors show up and ask tough questions and make very well-reasoned arguments. Suddenly the wheels come off the proposal a little bit, and there have been some surprising outcomes. So never let people doubt the power that they have as residents of the town if they show up and they speak up. And the third one is to step up. It's time for everybody to take on a leadership role, whether you want to or not. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, gosh, you know, I can't wait to go speak in public tonight, or I'm gonna, you know, run for office. These are different times, and we are called upon to make different choices, and we are called upon to push beyond our comfort levels and to step up and volunteer to serve on decision-making boards. We have done that on the climate. We have members of the Chatham Climate Action Network serve on the Energy Committee, on the Conservation Commission, on the Planning Board, and our newest member has a position on the Zoning Board. And so we make sure that climate issues are addressed when those decisions are being discussed. And so that's a really important element of what we're talking about here. Other elements that we have found that have been helpful is understanding what's important to the community, what interests are, what issues are important to them, and produce some output, some collateral, webinars. We've moved away from brochures and printed material. We won't do any of that anymore. We do have a website, so we put a lot of material. We try to put it there. We wish we were better at social media, because if we were, we think we'd have a lot more information out there. We're working on trying to find people who are good at that. But for the meantime, we've gotten pretty good at developing Zoom webinars. Again, they're free. It's not that tough. You put your slides together, or and invite some outside folks in to talk to people. We have found it really helpful to engage young people because their voices are really, really need to be heard. And in many tables, they are not sitting there. And so we've made a big effort to go into the schools and talk to classes and talk to the students in town. You can produce a little newsletter. The Climate Collaborative's newsletter now has over 2,600 subscribers. We don't create any content, we curate it. So we collect the best articles, the best scientific reports, the best of everything that we see over the course of a week or two, and we put it together and we put it out there. And you know, a lot of people are now reading it. If you don't subscribe, there's a link in here to do so. Sign up for it. It's a great, every issue is totally packed. So there's lots of different ways that you can connect and with your community, that you can reach people that aren't normally reached. The other thing I would say is develop relationships with local businesses. Talk to the local nurseries about what native plants they are carrying. At the same time that you're talking to people about why it makes climate sense to plant natives in their yard, you need to be talking to the vendors to make sure that they understand that there's going to be a demand, or there is a demand, and that they've got the stock to meet it. Talk to restaurants. That's what we're starting to do right now, and get them on board for doing some demonstration dinners. There's lots of resources available, is kind of the point that you can use. Plymouth is part of the South Shore chapter, I think, of MCAN. MCAN has a treasure trove of resources. You should use that. The Cape Cod Climate Collaborative also does that. We have a website that has just been revamped and is now being repopulated with new resources as we get time and ability. We've been uploading like crazy. We're going to keep doing that. So that will be, hopefully everything will be there. Again, these are all links. You can link to our network, or you can find videos of all of those webinars. They're all posted on our website. So if you want to see how that was done, register for the Net Zero conference and meet the folks who are just next door on the Cape and all around the state. And of course, the Woodwell Centers just put out, not just, but their new series called Beyond 1.5 starts, I think, Dave, I'm going to say Wednesday or Thursday this week. Yep. It'll be every 2 weeks. And they're going to be cutting edge, fabulous webinar productions, and urge you to sign up for that. And so what we've learned in Chatham, and the good news and the bad news is, and I have to credit Ernest Hemingway, who wrote a line in, and gosh, I think the sun also rises, I'm not sure, but he said, you know, he had a character say, change happens really, really slowly, and then it happens all at once. And that's true of both what we're experiencing with climate change, and it has to be true of our response to that. So we're trying to make it happen all at once and taking all the above approach to it. Urge you to do the same. Would love to connect with you guys, Sustainable Plymouth. I think we could, Chatham Climate Action Network would have a great relationship with you. We could support each other. Would be happy to do that. And you can reach me at janet@capecodclimate.org. And thank you so much for inviting me tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Janet and David. And if we were all together, we would do the traditional applause. So I would encourage you to do thumbs up, applause, anything else that lets them know that thank you very much. This was very useful, and it's just a start. We have about 20 minutes for your question and answers, maybe 15. And I would encourage you to think for a moment. I know several of you undoubtedly have questions about information that has been presented. And so if you have an information question, that's one category. Perhaps there's questions of insight. Dave and Janet both have shared their insights from the work that they've done, the organizations that they're involved in, and you might want to have them elaborate on an insight that they've shared. And what Sustainable Plymouth has invested itself in for tonight's discussion is that we leave this with inspiration to do more action. And so if you have ideas that you want to share that are building off of things that Dave and Janet have shared, we can do that as well. But may I ask, I'm going to go to the chat function here. I do want to address that Joseph had mentioned that it's really important that we not lose sight of the fact that at the federal level and beyond that, climate change policy and functions need to occur. Our focus tonight is really what we can do in our own backyard. That's not to say that we ought not be still advocating to our federal, state representatives that things need to happen at the national level. But I'm going to ask that we focus initially in our discussion about things that are going on local. And in the chat, I wanted to tell you that some links have been provided there for you to follow up on after the meeting as well. But let me, if I may, see a hand of someone that would like to ask a specific question about the information that they have heard tonight. And Anatole is the first person that I see. So Anatole, please, a concise question and short, please.
Yes, this is a question for Janet. I wonder if the Chatham Energy Committee plans to propose a mandatory solar petition, or if you know any other municipalities who plan to do that.
And I don't know the answer to that. We did not discuss that today when we first met about what the Energy Committee is doing about that. We just talked about the net zero building code, but I can find out for you and let you know.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Anatole and Janet. Another question from our gallery here, if I may. I'm not seeing a raising of hands of anyone. I would like to share with you, if I'm not mistaken, and if no one's chimed in, one of the things that Dave talked about regarding temperatures caught my attention. And I wanted to share with you some information because the concern about 90 degrees and higher is definitely a concern that it is coming our way. The draft hazard mitigation plan is also trying to prepare our town for thinking about how rising temperatures are going to create hazards for us with which to deal. What I would like to encourage you to also understand is that there's a fair amount of evidence in the health community that temperatures that get above 80 degrees begin to have negative effects on vulnerable populations. That could be children that are playing outside, that could be workers that are working outside, it could be elderly who don't have adequate conditioning. The report that I was looking at was focusing on historical data, much as Janet mentioned. They're not really looking forward at the projections of what's coming forward, and I think that's a deficit in our orientation. This summer in Plymouth, we had 43 days that were over 80 degrees. 7 of those had feels like temperatures, there were 7 days over 90 degrees. Of those 43, I believe it was roughly half of them, the temperatures felt like they were in the 90s. And of those 70-degree days over 90, it feels like temperature was over 100 in 6 out of 7 cases. What I'm trying to encourage us to be thinking about is that the circumstances that we're facing now, for the most of us, might not feel like they are a challenge. But for a great many of us, they are indeed already cautionary concerns. And if there anything more that you might be able to focus on, David, regarding temperature concerns for the Southeast Massachusetts area?
I'll take it a little bit beyond Southeast Massachusetts, because you're right. I mean, it is a concern, and there are vulnerable populations who will be at risk. But we are a global community, and we really aren't going to get the worst of it. If you look at the aftermath of Ida in Louisiana, there was an article a couple days ago in the New York Times that I think more deaths occurred from the heat after the hurricane, where people didn't have power, didn't have air conditioning, didn't have running water, and were really, really vulnerable. And there was more deaths from that than from the actual hurricane, I believe. You look at areas of kind of Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indian border. We're looking at wet bulb temperatures there in the next 10 to 20 years that are no longer survivable outdoors. And these are societies that rely on kind of agrarian labor to function. And you can't be outside at some of the temperatures that we're looking at. And these are really temperatures that haven't been common on Earth anywhere up until now. So I think it's good and important to think about the vulnerable populations here. But there are many people in the world who are going to get it a lot worse than us, and in the kind of health context that you're talking about, Dale. And so while I am concerned about my immediate neighbors, I'm even more concerned about my global neighbors who will suffer the most. Sorry, I know we're talking about Plymouth and surrounding area, but
Well, it's a point well taken, and I think most of us that have conscientiousness about what is going on with global heating are aware that we don't have it as bad as many places. But I was glad that you mentioned, the after effects of Ida. It can happen anywhere, and the Pacific Northwest was an area or region of this country and in Canada that thought that they could never have a heat wave of the sort that they've just gone through, and that often referred to as a black swan event. We anticipate that it'll be more of the same or a little bit worse, and we can't really be sure that we won't have our own event anytime in the next 30 years, if in fact the climate impacts are built in. There's no predicting where those events are going to occur. Fortunately, it's not here right now, and hopefully it abates everywhere. Anyone else with a question for our speakers or of Sustainable Plymouth in the work that we're doing?
A question for
Andrea,
Janet.
please.
So Janet, you mentioned that you've been working with the schools to engage young people. And so I was just wondering, like, what kind of approach you've found most successful, who you've been working with in the schools, what kind of presentations, like what the focus is of those presentations?
We've worked with the teachers mostly because we've met them through some other programs that other organizations that we attended and they attended, and got chatting at the tables and said, how would you like a presentation to bring into your class? And we actually have reached the point where one of the middle school teachers now sits on the board of the Climate Collaborative. So we fostered that relationship, and we work through them to identify the best, most appropriate, most up-to-date materials and curriculum to bring in to present to the kids. We keep it very short. It's like half classes, 20 minutes or so. That's about all. But that's been, the teachers has been the best, most effective way.
Is it mostly science teachers?
Science, social studies, math, not always. I mean, the teachers really understand the impacts of climate run across all curriculum areas. So we've talked to people in a number of different areas.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else that would have a question for our speakers or others in the organization of Sustainable Plymouth? And if not, I wanted to quickly point out to you that in the chat function are additional links that have been provided by Joseph and Dave for your information. You can access these through the recording, if not now. And Sustainable Plymouth is really encouraging everyone that is in the community here, but in our neighboring communities, to think about ways that we can collaborate together to have greater impact. So it was really encouraging on my part to hear Janet talk about the ways in which Chatham specifically is working, but seeing how Chatham is part of the 5C to be able to support each other. And I think there's an invitation that's embedded in this, that Plymouth is part of a larger ecosystem, the Pine Barrens. Well, we need to see ourselves as a regional community. At the same time, we're trying to affect what's going on in our town and the ways in which we have been addressing town governance needs to continue. And I want to encourage all of you to, if after this presentation later tonight, you do have ideas that you want to share with any member of Sustainable Plymouth, the advisory board, the working groups, please send us email as to what's on your mind. And as Janet was saying, if you've been not as active as you could be, we could definitely use your contributions to the working groups in our organization to promote your ideas, promote ideas that we're kicking around. And as I said, we're learning as we go. We're trying to draw on our experiences, greater knowledge, greater wisdom, and greater inspiration as to being able to do more. And so join us at first opportunity or when you feel so inspired. Andrea, were you going to give us a closure for the evening?
Can I just briefly address the comment that Andrea just put in the chat about questions for local reps and plans to get to 50% or 100% renewable? I think that's a good question. I think putting that entirely on local officials, it's challenging, and I think a lot of responsibility there lies at the utility level. So I think it's an excellent thing to kind of have as a town goal, and it's a good question to ask. But part of the strategy needs to be, local generation, and part of the strategy needs to be pressuring utilities to kind of restructure and have a fundamentally different outlook towards renewables. I'm not I'm not an electric grid expert, but I hesitate to kind of put all that on a overwhelmed selectman. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you both, Janet and Dave, for your presentations. That was really, really fantastic. So let me just share my screen real quick for a couple slides to wrap up. So the next Sustainable Plymouth meeting will be November 15th at 6:30. So going forward, we're going to be meeting every other month, and it's the third Monday of each month, third Monday of every other month. So after November, the next meeting will be January. And I'm just going to toggle back real quick to the dates for the next working group meetings in case anybody would like to join either of those. So October 18th for the climate working group and November 8th for the plastics and solid waste group. And then just to plug a couple upcoming events. So I just added the event that Janet was talking about here, but we also have the upcoming Herring art show on September 25th. And then we also have the Plymouth Townwide Cleanup on October 2nd. And then another upcoming event is a tour through the Foothills Preserve, where there was just recently a big restoration project. So David Gould from the Department of Environmental Affairs will be joining us to take us on a walk through that property. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we also have a list of resources on our website that we welcome you to check out. And unless anybody else has any other events they would like to mention, that wraps us up for this evening. Is there anything else anyone wanted to highlight? Any upcoming events? No? Okay. All right. Well, thank you to everyone so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again at a future meeting. Thank you again to Dave and Janet for joining us.
Indeed. Thanks so very much.
Have a good night, everyone.